Hello, everybody. Darlene here with Freedom for Nova Scotia. I'm home doing this little video because we had a rally today, and although I had the equipment, we didn't have Vince, so unfortunately we couldn't get the music to work, so there was no sense in trying to get speeches done. So it ended up being a pretty good rally. No rain the whole time we were there. There was 5 of us that showed up, and we did get lots of support by cars going by and stuff, lots of honking and everything. Hello, everybody. So I didn't want to waste this speech and decided that I'll record it anyway at home, and I make it for the July 22nd Freedom for Nova Scotia Cape Breton rally. Here goes. Our topic, if you can see the sign, Canadians say rescind Bill C-18, the Online News Act. So let's talk about our freedom of choice and freedom of speech and how our government is slowly taking away from us on the internet. Bill C-18, the Online News Act, the general policy is bad for press, independence, and competition, as well as a misguided attempt to require payments for links. The bill requires compensation for facilitating access to news in any way, in any amount. Bill C-18 is a shakedown with requirements to pay for nothing more than listing Canadian media organizations with hyperlinks in a search index, social media posts, or possibly even a tweet. At a time when we need the public to access a credible news, Canadian Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez believes that large internet companies that engage in the act of facilitating access to news, not copying, not using, not even directly linking, should pay for doing so. The relevant provisions in this bill in section 2.2, which states, for the purposes of this act, news content is made available if A, the news content or any portion of it is reproduced, or B, access to the news content or any portion of it is facilitated by any means, including an index, aggregation, or ranking of news content. There was a time when this government fashioned itself as pro-internet, supportive of net neutrality, and a staunch defender of fundamental freedoms, including freedom of the press and other media communications. Yet it cannot credibly claim to support those principles and simultaneously legislate barriers to accessing media by mandating payments for facilitating access to media sources. How does the entire Bill C-18 framework fit within the federal government's jurisdiction? It isn't broadcast. It isn't telecommunications. It isn't copyright. If the government claims powers over anything involving the internet, then it believes there are no real limits on its jurisdictions. Millions of Canadians choose to access media through search and social media. Mandating payments for services that facilitate access to media sources runs counter to basic freedoms and casts aside the suggestion that the bill is limited to a quid pro quo of payment for links to news articles. Bill C-18 is shamefully overbroad, an embarrassment to the news media lobby that demanded it, and unworthy of a government that sees itself as a model for the rest of the world on media freedoms. An escalating tug-of-war between the Liberal government and big tech, with Canadian news content in the middle, is heating up in Canada. Many Canadians are concerned about the consequences of the Liberal government's proposed solution, the Online News Act, which seeks to force Meta, which is Facebook, and Alphabet, Google, and others to spend millions to access and share Canadian content, to compensate Canadian media publications for making news content available on their platforms. A new Angus Reid survey shows that concern over backlash and blocked access to Canadian news content is driving a growing push for Ottawa to rescind Bill C-18, the Online News Act. The tech giant's response has been to block Canadian news content from their platforms once the legislation comes into effect. That has left many Canadians contemplating what the loss of Google and Facebook to access local news will mean. New data from the nonprofit Angus Reid put the question to Canadians, and 48% of those asked indicated that Ottawa should back down in its battle with big tech and rescind Bill C-18 legislation. For Canadians, the loss of Google and Facebook as news vehicles would be considerable. Each is used by more than 2 in 5 Canadians daily for news, a proportion higher than all other platforms and websites. Only about 15% of Canadians say they currently pay for online news subscriptions to Canadian news. 32% of Canadians asked seek out local news from Canadian news sites. 28% get it from Facebook, while 23% get it from Google News. As the Liberal government and tech giants go head-to-head over the future of digital Canadian news, 63% are concerned about losing access to Canadian news on Facebook and Google, their go-to platforms. The Trudeau government has sought to position themselves as the defenders of homegrown Canadian media against the supposedly dangerous American big tech companies. Justin Trudeau took the rhetoric to new depths when he compared the fight against those companies to Canada's fight against fascism in World War II. Trudeau's comparison was denounced by many at the time, saying things like, "Talk about trivializing the sacrifices of our veterans and the real horrors of war and the Holocaust. This is shameful hyperbole that has no place in the debate over poorly drafted legislation. There is no equivalence to the millions of lives lost in wars to defend freedom." That was tweeted by Mark Goldboard on July 6th. To my knowledge, Trudeau has not repeated the comparison since. Likely this is a recognition on the part of the Liberals that it went too far. Still, rhetoric from Liberal MPs and some of the legacy media towards the tech companies has seemed completely over the top. Google and Meta, Facebook have shown a willingness to give money to news organizations in Canada. Facebook had a number of agreements to fund journalism in this country before Bill C-18 was rammed through. Those agreements have now been canceled. What the tech companies object to is the idea that they should pay for providing links to content. The tech companies argue rightfully that they are the ones providing a service to those who post the links, not the other way around. Why should they pay someone to use a service that they are providing for free? Canadians as a whole seem to recognize how absurd any idea that is. Unsurprisingly, 75% of Conservatives want the government to rescind the legislation. The Liberals also have an issue with their own supporters. 32% of Liberal supporters want to see it rescinded, 38% wanting it to go through, and 30% unsure. After all the rhetoric and aggressive attacks made by the Liberals in relation to Bill C-18, the fact that they have only won over about 1/3 of their own supporters is stunning. Bill C-18 is more popular among the Bloc than it is among the Liberals. Just 15% of Bloc voters want Bill C-18 to be rescinded, while 46% support it. 38% say they're unsure. After all, Trudeau's most unhinged rhetoric against the tech companies was in French, so he appears to be targeting his most aggressive messaging to Quebec. Bill C-18 is a bad idea, bandaging a real problem. Journalism is in crisis, and we absolutely need to save it. But the government built their relief bill on the false premise that large online services are collecting large amounts of revenue from news stories being shared on their platform. But the bill also assumed the platforms would never refuse to host news, even if they were being charged for it. Now, Meta and Google have called the government's bluff, and the government is scrambling to keep Bill C-18 from being a total disaster. Despite good intentions, not a single dollar in Bill C-18 is earmarked for local news. Instead, the negotiations and revenue distribution favor the few remaining legacy media conglomerates. The PBQ, the government's independent analysis body, estimated that 2/3 of the revenue made from Bill C-18 would go to just CBC, Bell, and Rogers, not newspapers or local media. And now we're seeing proof that even if Bill C-18 does create revenue, it won't trickle down to where it needs it most, local news. Bell filed their application to the CRTC to defund local news, knowing that C-18 would pass, and before Google announced their plans to stop hosting news, which means that even they don't see Bill C-18 revenue as a legitimate solution. Fingers are being pointed in every direction, but that won't help stabilize our news. Ultimately, our representatives, your MPs, my MP, need to commit to fixing this and making sure news revenue goes up. We need to move fast to capitalize on this narrow moment where the government might finally be ready to believe that they've made the wrong move. Our good American friend, Lieutenant Steve Rogers, says that no president, prime minister, or any government on the face of this earth will ever take from the people these gifts from God. That is freedom and liberty. He continues to promote the Campaign for America, the international call for assistance, distress signal, and urges everyone to continue to send the SOS from Canada to the United States of America at Campaign for America, P.O. Box 225, Nutley, New Jersey, 07110. Lieutenant Rogers says they need at least 100,000 signatures, and the deadline is September 15th of this year. Canadians no longer have a democracy or the rule of law with our government. Freedom of speech. We fear communism. So get those letters out in the mail as soon as possible and help Lieutenant Steve Rogers get all those signatures he needs to help us Canadians, as well as Americans, win this battle for our freedoms. Let's talk about one of those independent news outlets, media outlets that Justin Trudeau talks so highly of. CBC. Yep. Trudeau said they were an independent news agencies. What a joke. What dictionary tells him that Canadian taxpayer dollars going to a news agency makes it independent? Well, Elon Musk certainly called him out. Here are some facts you need to know about the CBC. The CBC is biased and promotes a liberal agenda that does not represent the views of many Canadians. In the words of the columnist Lorne Gunther, the Libs and CBC have the same interests, live in the same neighborhoods, share the same values and prejudices. They agree on climate alarmism, the size of government, the need to combat pandemic with complete lockdowns and vaccine mandates, criminal justice leniency, wide open immigration, the superiority of the public sector over the private, and internet censorship, among other topics. The CBC is so woke, and some of their journalists are quitting. Tara Henley wrote an article last year exposing how the CBC has become a toxic and intolerant workplace that stifles creativity and diversity of thought. She said that the CBC has a one-track mind that only cares about identity politics and social issues while ignoring other important topics like economics and foreign affairs. They are wasteful, spending millions of tax dollars on salaries, perks, and bureaucracy. The CBC's president is paid more than $400,000 a year, which is more than the Prime Minister of Canada makes. They also spend lavishly on travel, entertainment, and office space. They have no incentive to be efficient or innovative because they know they can always rely on the government to bail them out. That's why they lose popular programs like Hockey Night in Canada. And they're actually, and ad revenue continues to plummet. The CBC is supposed to be independent and impartial, but how can they be when they depend on government for their survival? They receive more than $1 billion in annual funding from the federal government, which creates a conflict of interest and a lack of accountability. They are anti-competitive, crowding out private broadcasters and journalists who could provide better quality and diversity of content. Their $1 billion subsidy gives them an unfair advantage over other media outlets. This distorts the market and reduces consumer choice. The CBC has a history of hiring and promoting journalists and commentators who are aligned with the Liberal Party or other progressive causes. For example, Susan Delacourt and Chantal Hébert are both tied to the Trudeau Foundation. These are not neutral or objective voices, but partisan activists who use their platforms to influence public opinion. They're supposed to be impartial, yet they literally sued the Conservative Party in Canada during a federal election campaign. In 2019, the CBC filed a lawsuit against the Conservatives for using clips of their broadcasts in their campaign ads. This was a blatant attempt to interfere with the democratic process and silence criticism of the Liberal Party. By the way, the CBC lost their suit. These are just some of the reasons why the CBC is not fulfilling its mission. The CBC is misleading Canadians, not informing us. They are dividing Canadians, not representing us. The CBC has been given chance after chance to becoming the neutral, unbiased public broadcaster that Canadians have been promised for almost 90 years. But instead, they've proven time and time again to be the mouthpiece for the Liberal NDP coalition. This is what the Trudeau government wants with Bill C-18, the online newslet, to have the government propaganda pumping machine be the only source of online news available to Canadians. I say defund CBC and sign any petition that is out there. Keep making the noise that is the government hates to hear. It's already been proven time and time again, when the people speak loud enough, the government will listen if it means they think they will stay in power. Call your MPs and tell them to rescind Bill C-18 and continue this fight for our freedom of choice, freedom of press, freedom of speech. Our democracy might depend on it. Morality is doing what is right, no matter what you have been taught. Obedience is doing what you are taught, no matter what is right. It is up to us to say no when we know that something is wrong or not right. It's up to us to hold our government to account. Remember, they work for us. We must not comply to tyranny. We must unite in non-compliance to this undemocratic government. What are you going to do? I will not comply. I will never comply. Will you comply? Hoo-ah, fellow freedom fighters. Hoo-ah. I thank you, and good day.